Okay, it looks like it's 1 o'clock. So welcome everyone to Jerisha Spring Program and the first class in this 4-class series on suffering and prosperity, a Jewish philosophical exploration. In today's lecture, we will discuss some classical philosophical formulations of the problem of evil and compare them to the dominant formulation in biblical, rabbinic, and Jewish philosophical texts. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Aaron Segal. Dr. Segal is the Michael and Bella Guggenheim Lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame, rabbinic ordination from Chief Rabbinic of Israel, and has published widely in metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and Jewish philosophy. And with that, I'll turn this to Dr. Segal.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. So before we begin with the topic proper, I just wanted to say a few words about sort of approaching a topic like this. There's something I think daunting about approaching the topic of evil and giving a lecture series on the topic of evil, and that's because sort of you sense its enormity, and that's in one sense, you know, the enormity of just what's been written about this. Pretty much any religious thinker of significance has written about the topic of evil. So there's just so much to contend with. But of course, in some sense, more importantly, the enormity of the experiences and the phenomena, the events that we're forced to contend with that are evil. And that's especially true given the immediate context for this lecture series, which is a pandemic that's upended economies, it's taken countless lives. And we're also sitting here today on the heels of Yom HaShoah, in which we're forced to confront an evil of nearly inconceivable magnitude and dimensions. So I'll just, regarding the first limitation, that obviously in 4 lectures, we're not going to be able to really do justice to everything important that's been said about the topic. That we'll just have to acknowledge and go on. Regarding the second point, I think we first should note that anytime we engage in theology, if we're willing to do so, we're dealing with something that's enormous in some sense, something that's just so radically beyond us that we should feel out of our depth, and that this is really just a special case. So with that in mind, I'm going to beg your indulgence and ask us to, at least for the time being, set aside those calamities of world historic proportion that sometimes leap to mind when we think of this topic, and we'll of course eventually have to reckon with the totality of the human experience, the totality of all the evil that's been suffered. But there's certainly more than enough evil or just bad things of the more humdrum variety to generate very great difficulty for the religious believer. Right? So I'm sure that each of us in our own lives has experienced or known others who have experienced personal tragedy or great hardship, and even in some cases, lives that have been shattered beyond repair. And these are not crises of world historic significance, but they're more than enough to get the problem going. Okay, so with that introduction in mind, let's get started on the topic. And please do feel free to jump in with questions if you have them, clarifications. I'm just going to share the source sheet, which was it's in the chat, but this way I'll also be able to scroll down. Okay. So some of you may be familiar with some of this. I guess we'll get a sense as we go through how familiar this is. But the problem of evil, the main point I want to make today is that it's really several problems, many problems perhaps, a multifarious issue that confronts us. Right? But there's sort of a standard formulation. If we're talking about the philosophical problem, that's another point I should make. We're talking about a theoretical or intellectual problem, which is not, of course, to minimize the experiential problem and how one actually deals experientially with evil. And there might be a close relationship between these two, as we'll see in a later lecture. But first and foremost, we're going to be dealing with the intellectual problem as such, the existence of evil and the problem that it presents for a religious believer, specifically a believer in God, the God of, let's say, classical theism, even I'd say classical Judaism. And that problem, like I started to say, has a rather standard formulation in the history of philosophy. David Hume quotes Epicurus, even though I don't think we have any surviving evidence of this particular quote. But David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, quotes the philosopher of antiquity, Epicurus, as having asked certain questions that are still unanswered. The questions are, in his words, is he willing, God, to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? Right? And that's a pretty standard formulation, and not much changes through the course of the next several centuries in formulating the problem of evil. So here's a quote that I took from C.S. Lewis, the beginning of his work, The Problem of Pain, dedicated to the problem of evil. It's quite similar to what we have in Hume. He says, if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy, which is perhaps a little stronger than what Hume says. But at any rate, that's one assumption. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power or both. This is the problem of pain, as Lewis calls it, in its simplest form. So the idea here is that there's a mismatch between what we would expect to be the case and what is the case. What we would expect to be the case if the God of classical theism, classical Judaism in our case, exists. If there is a God who answers to that description, who is perfectly good, perfectly just, perfectly righteous, and also almighty, then presumably he would prevent any of these evils that occur. And yet, of course, that doesn't seem to be the case, right? There is evil, it seems. We witness it, and so our expectations are shattered. Now, this formulation itself, this version, can be made more precise, and maybe the most significant way it can and should be made more precise, and is in the contemporary literature, is that the assumption that God would prevent every bad thing from happening doesn't seem quite right. It doesn't seem to follow just from his being even perfectly good and almighty, because maybe there are evils that are necessary for something else, maybe for achieving some greater good, or maybe in order to prevent some greater evil. So the way it's traditionally or standardly formulated now is that God would prevent any gratuitous evils, any evils that don't serve any such function, that aren't necessary to achieve a greater good or prevent some greater evil. And yet there are or seem to be gratuitous evils. Okay? And that qualification is something that will play a central role in future lectures when we start looking at answers to these questions. But at any rate, that's the standard question. That's the standard way the problem is put. But now in the history of philosophy, that's not the only way that it's been put. Recent work in the history of philosophy has called our attention to other formulations, or really other versions of this problem. They're not exactly the very same problem. And one such version is something you find in the medieval philosophers, and then in the early modern philosophers as well, who are contending with this, most famously Leibniz, who you may know, wrote a work whose long name is The Essays of Theodicy on the Goodness of God, the Freedom of Man, and the Origin of Evil, sometimes just called the Theodicy. He wrote a very lengthy work dedicated to this question, the problem of evil, and trying to justify God's ways, trying to offer what's now called a theodicy. And in his formulation of the problem, he really formulates a few different problems. One of them is the one we've just noted. Another one seems to be somewhat different, as commentators point out, and that's the problem that's known as the authorship of evil problem. That it seems that God is himself implicated in evil, that he is morally and practically responsible for the evils that take place. So this creates sort of a moral stain on God's character. And the way this problem gets off the ground seems to, it requires certain assumptions about God's relationship, his causal relationship to the created world, which the first version does not require. But given those assumptions, God is intimately involved in everything that occurs, at least in sustaining the universe from moment to moment, in its form and the shape that it takes. In so doing, God is thereby implicated. He's thereby made into a moral monster in some sense. And so here the charge is a more grave charge against God, that it's not just that he fails to prevent something he could have prevented, but that he's actually the author of evil itself. Right? And there are some interesting differences between these two, just to get us to start thinking sort of philosophically about this question. I'll just throw out two differences between these versions. One difference is, would it make any difference if necessitarianism were true, which is the view that every truth is a necessary truth, that the world couldn't have been different in any way whatsoever. Now, this is a view that was rarely held in the history of philosophy. It was held most famously by Spinoza. We might ask ourselves, if a view like that were true, well, would that solve the problem? And it seems that the answer would be, well, it depends what the problem is. If the problem is the first one we mentioned, then just like we noted, it's really only going to be gratuitous evils that God is going to be held liable for in some sense, right? The problem is because he's not preventing these evils that could have been prevented. But if Spinoza was right, then no evils could have been prevented, because nothing could be any different from the way it in fact is. Whereas if the problem is the authorship of evil, as Leibniz and others suggest here, then maybe there still would be a problem. And in some sense, that would still be a moral stain on God, even if there's nothing he could really have done about it. And conversely, we might ask ourselves, what if there had been alongside God? What if there is alongside God, right, who is understood, say, to be not only perfectly good, but also himself a necessary being? He had to exist. But let's say alongside God, there was some sort of fundamental, foundational evil being, right, counterposed to God, but who didn't have to exist. It's just a contingent being. Right? Well, if that were the case, would the problem of evil rear its ugly head? And again, it might depend on what the problem is. Right? If the problem is the first that we suggested, then we still might say there's a problem here. Right? God should eliminate this evil. Right? Even though it's fundamental, it's a contingent thing. God is almighty. He could decide if he wanted to eliminate this evil being, this counterweight. And the fact that he hasn't done so is to be laid at his doorstep. He's responsible for that. Whereas if the problem is the authorship of evil, then assuming there's something else that's fundamental, right, even though that might run contrary to the monotheism that's at the core of theism, but supposing that were true, though, we still wouldn't have, at least wouldn't have this problem, the authorship of evil, because God is not responsible for the existence of that evil being. He didn't bring it into existence. It was just there, so to speak, alongside God. Okay, so that's the kind of questions, and if you're thinking halachically, you would see them as nafkaminas between these two ways, two versions of the problem of evil. Okay, but this is sort of by way of setup, because what I'm interested in primarily here is what is the version of the problem of evil that we get in Tanakh and in Chazal, and maybe even in the Rishonim, in the medieval Jewish philosophers and thinkers. And what it seems to me is, well, you might get several different ones, and maybe some of them align closely with what we've already discussed. But I think there is at least one problem that doesn't get treated, doesn't get presented in standard discussions of evil, but it is a genuine problem. And it's one that our tradition, Tanakh and Chazal and the Rishonim, were really contending with primarily. And so we're gonna sort of misunderstand what they're doing. We're gonna misunderstand what their answers are supposed to do if we misunderstand or misconstrue the question that they're raising. So we better first get clear on what that question is. So what is the question as it's come down to us from Chazal? Anyone can feel free to shout out. How is the question, the problem of evil, colloquially known in circles of Jewish thought, or even just when we as traditional Jews, or those traditional Jews, think about this problem? Anyone can feel free to jump in. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you generally, translating this problem into Hebrew, it's not difficult, but it doesn't sound traditional once you do it. Right? Bayat haroa is how we would translate the problem of evil nowadays, but you don't have that term, that formulation in early sources. What you do have is the problem of tzaddik viralo, right? And as Chaim points out, it's tzaddik viralo, rasha v'tovlo, which we will focus on a good deal in a second. But usually it's just the problem of tzaddik viralo. Right? If you think about the problem as tzaddik viralo, the fact that the righteous suffer, that's how we usually characterize the central question of the book of Eov. It's already, in some sense, it seems, a restriction of the problem of evil. We're not worried in that formulation about evil just as such. Right? It seems that we're only bothered, or those who raise this question are bothered by a specific kind of bad, a specific kind of evil, and that is the suffering of those who are righteous. Right? Now, if that's all we had, I mean, if the presentation in the Psukim and in rabbinic sources was just the side of tzaddik viralo, and I think a natural reconstrual of that problem in traditional terms, traditional, I mean now traditional philosophical terms, would be to say, well, we have really the same problem, but they jumped ahead a few steps. And here's what I mean. Like, maybe they really did have the standard problem of evil in mind. Okay, the problems that we've just mentioned from Epicurus and Hume and whatnot. But they also had in mind a sort of immediate answer, the so-called retributivist theodicy. Okay, that the answer to this question is that all suffering, all bad things, all evil is punishment for wrongdoing. Right? And this is not a theodicy that is unfounded in our sources, right? And it's certainly well-founded, I would say. You have it in various sources, both in Tanakh and in Chazal. It doesn't mean that it's the dominant one. It doesn't mean that it's going to survive in the end, but it certainly exists. And then maybe given that, that's what leads now to this formulation of tzaddik viralo. Essentially, it's an epicycle on a theodicy responding to the original question. Right? So if the original question was, why is God permitting any gratuitous evil? The answer is, well, there are no gratuitous evils. All the evil we see is suffering inflicted as punishment, and then someone comes along and says, Moshe Rabbeinu or Rabbi Yochanan, and says, but look, 1 second, that's just not true, right? There's a tzaddik viralo. There is a righteous person who suffers as well, someone who doesn't deserve this, doesn't deserve any punishment, doesn't deserve this as punishment, right? And that you could understand the tzaddik viralo component in that way, right? As still participating in this original formulation, original version of the problem of evil. But I think that's deeply problematized. That understanding is sort of made untenable, I think, actually, by the fact that it doesn't stop there. It's not just a problem of tzaddik viralo, it's a problem of rasha v'tovlo as well. Okay, and this is not something that began in the Gemara that we'll see in a second in Brachot. It's quite clearly at work in the earlier biblical formulations of the problem. Okay, so in Kohelet, for example, in Perek Chet, Pasuk Yudalid, Yesh Hevel Asher Nasa La'aretz, Asher Yesh Tzadikim, Asher Magia Lehem K'maaseh HaReshaim, Yesh Reshaim Shemagia Lehem K'maaseh HaTzadikim. He cites both prongs of this problem here in a sort of weak version of it, I'd say, that there are those who are righteous, who suffer, who get that what we would think would be appropriate for a rasha, and vice versa, there are those rishaim who get what we think is appropriate or deserving for a tzaddik. I see that there are a bunch of questions in the chat. Maybe let me just finish this thought and then I'll take a look at those. This is made even more, it's stated more emphatically and strengthened in the next parak in Kohelet, in Parak Tet, Pasuk Bet and Gimel. We have Hakol Kasher Lakol Mikre Echad LaTzadik VeLaRasha LaTov VeLaTahor VeLaTamei VeLaZoveach VeLasher Einenu Zoveach Katov Kachoteh Hanishba Kasher Shvu'a Yarei Zera B'chol Asher Nasa Tachat HaShemesh Ki Mikre Echad Lakol. So here you have a strengthening in two respects at least. For one, it's a much stronger claim now. It's not just that sometimes the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper. It's that there's no evident connection whatsoever between one's level of righteousness and the good one receives. Right? It's not as though there are these aberrations that we have to explain. It's systemic. There's just no connection as far as we can tell between the behavior of a tzaddik and what we would expect would ensue. And on top of that, the Pasuk Gimel, its statement, Zera b'chol asher na'asa tachat hashemesh, this itself is the greatest evil. But this is the evil that sort of, I guess, epitomizes what evil is. Right? It's not the instances of suffering themselves that epitomize evil. It's the fact that evil is distributed, evil and good are distributed in this way that there seem to be indifferent to the deeds of those who suffer or those who prosper. So to suggest that we have here just an epicycle on a theodicy that's addressing the original question doesn't seem right. Right? What we have is the standard classical formulation now from the Gemara and Brachot. Now I mean standard classically Jewish, not classically your standard philosophical. Mipnei ma yesh tzadik v'tovlo, v'yesh tzadik v'ralo, yesh rasha v'tovlo, v'yesh rasha v'ralo. This is the question that Moshe Rabbeinu asked, and according to at least one opinion, was denied the answer to. The one question that he asked that he was not given the answer to. But the question, as you can see, is a list of 4 cases, right? It's why is there a tzaddik v'tovlo, a righteous person who's good, and a tzaddik that's ralo? And there's a rasha v'tovlo and a rasha v'ralo. Right? Now this doesn't fit, this second half doesn't fit very well at all with the standard formulations of the problem of evil. Rarely are contemporary philosophers of religion who are discussing the problem of evil bothered by the flourishing of the wicked. The fact that there isn't any evil there, the fact that they don't suffer, that's not something that they get worked up about. Right? And we can ask ourselves a question similar to what we asked to sort of sharpen the difference between Leibniz on the one hand and Hume on the other hand. Ask yourselves, what would be the case if we held to a view that some Jewish thinkers actually did endorse in Amsterdam in the 17th century, known as universalism, known nowadays in the literature as universalism, that everyone eventually merits the world to come. That eventually everyone, no matter how wicked they are here, no matter how long it may take to get them there in one way or another, everyone, literally every human creature at least, will merit the world to come. Now, does that present a problem? Well, sometimes in the contemporary discussion, that's seen as a solution, right? It's seen as a solution to the problem of why there are these evildoers who will just perish and never succeed. And so what's put forward as a solution to that evil is, no, they will be saved in the end. Okay, this is the Christian terminology. They will, in the at the end of the day, merit the world to come, as we would put it. But that's only really a solution if you're thinking of the problem in maybe one of the first two ways. But if you're thinking of the problem along the lines of Kohelet or of this Gemara in Brachot, I don't think that's a solution. I think that only exacerbates the problem. I mean, it doesn't seem to be true at all that there is an alignment between one's righteousness, level of righteousness, and the good one receives, which is the crux of the problem in the Gemara in Brachot and in the Psukim in Kohelet. Okay, and we're going to sharpen that problem in a second, but I saw Chaya had a hand raised, and as I said, there's a bunch of things in the chat. Chaya, did you want to ask while I'm?
Well, I was just going to comment that maybe the difference between the Chazal that includes Rasha v'Tovlo, and I said this in the chat as well, is that they're not bothered by the problem of evil; they're bothered by injustice. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. So I was about to get to this. So that is certainly one way to put it, or one way to understand it. I was going to say first that the Rishonim were exquisitely sensitive, much more so than contemporary Jewish thinkers, say the last 300 years, to the fact that the problem is put this way, not just in terms of tzaddik v'ralo, but also in terms of rasha v'tovlo. So I have a passage here from Rav Yosef Albo in his Sefer HaIkarim, where he devotes a separate chapter to the existence, the problem of rasha v'tovlo, and he even goes so far as to claim that that's a more difficult challenge. And the reason he thinks it's more difficult is because it's so easy to identify people as rishaim, he thinks. You can see someone who commits acts, evil acts, and if you see that, then it doesn't matter if there's also something good about them. You know that they are rishaim. Whereas he thinks it's much harder to identify someone as a tzaddik. Someone can look like a tzaddik, a righteous person, but perhaps deep down, or even not so deep down, they're a rasha. I'm not endorsing that view, but at any rate, it's clear that he's calling attention to this dual aspect of the problem and highlighting the second one. But as I said, the contemporary Jewish philosophers or thinkers have been much less attuned to this. But one Jewish thinker who did is Hillel Zeitlin, the neo-Hasidic, before there was neo-Hasidism, really, Jewish thinker at the end of the 19th century, first half of the 20th century. He has a book on good and evil, and he calls attention to this fact, and he puts it exactly like you did, Chaya. He says that for Judaic view, because he's contrasting it with the Greek view and what he calls the Indian view. In the Jewish way of seeing things, the problem is one of injustice. Right? The problem is, how could there be injustice if God is perfectly just, right? Tzaddik v'yasharhu. And so, given that the problem is one of injustice, we can understand why the issue, the side of Rasha v'Tovlo, figures just as much into the problem as does Tzaddik v'Ralo. Okay, but now I think while that might capture some of what's going on, I don't think it gets everything. I don't think it gets it quite right if we're trying to understand the nature of the problem in Tanakh, or certain parts of Tanakh, at least in Chazal. But first of all, I don't think it captures the full existential depth of the problem that we find in Kohelet, where he finds himself despairing, right? And he says, as a result of this, everything is hevel, right? This is just all vanity. This seems to be a reaction, this reaction that the world is in some sense meaningless or absurd, is a reaction to the problem he's highlighting, which, if we're to understand, as Zeitlin does, that it's just a problem of sort of reconciling one of God's attributes, his attribute of justice, with what we see in the world, it doesn't seem to be sort of up to the task, if that's the entirety of the problem, in explaining the pathos, in explaining the depth of the reaction that Kohelet has. But a second point, I think, even more important in some ways, because it'll be relevant, even let's take the Gemara in Brachot, where it's not clear that it's accompanied by this sense of meaninglessness, is that, yeah, it's true that God is characterized as Tzaddik v'Yashar, but it's also true that that's only one of the ways in which he's characterized. Right? That's one of his attributes. And so I would think that contra Rav Yosef Albo, right, it's much harder actually to raise the problem of Rasha v'Tovlo. It's much harder to raise that problem because there could be all sorts of contrary values, that is, or attributes that God has that push God in the other direction of being good, even to those who are wicked. So it could be that his being righteous, his being just, pushes God in one direction, but maybe, at least in some cases, that has to be compensated by the fact, or counteracted by the fact that he's Rav Chesed, he's Erech HaPayim, right? He's slow to get angry, he's full of mercy. And so it seems like it would be very difficult to actually raise the problem, or be troubled by the problem of Rasha v'Tovlo if it were just a matter of reconciling God's justice with what we see in the world. Right? If it were just, in some ways, very similar to the traditional problem, but instead of focusing on God's goodness, it made use of God's being a tzaddik, God's being just. So I think that we can sort of deepen the suggestion that Zeitlin is making, and highlighting here the unique nature of the problem in Tanakh and Chazal by looking at, I have this piece here from the contemporary philosopher Mark Johnston, who's not a theist himself, but in this book, Surviving Death, he starts out by discussing Kant's claim that there is something of a moral imperative to hope, and maybe even to, in some sense, have the conviction that there is a moral order to the universe, and so the righteous will eventually prosper and the wicked will eventually suffer. Right? And in discussing that general claim, I think he puts the point nicely. He says, let's try another way to make the threat come alive. Consider Kohelet's remark: the battle does not always go to the strong, nor the race to the swift, nor wealth to men of understanding. Compare Ogden Nash's ditty, which indicates something of the actual character of human life. The rain, it raineth every day, or on the just and the unjust fellows, but mainly on the just, because the unjust have stolen their umbrellas, which I think you also have in Kohelet, maybe elsewhere, but the idea that it's sort of a zero-sum game, so that the prospering of the wicked comes at the expense of the righteous, and that's part of their suffering. But he goes on to say we can go further than Kohelet in a ditty and imagine a quasi-demonic scenario in which the signs are unequivocally reversed, where goodness is systematically punished and wickedness systematically rewarded. Rwanda, Kosovo, Moscow, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, parts of Iraq under Saddam, and sadly, parts of Iraq this very day. Now we understand perfectly well what morality requires of us in such a scenario. It requires that we soldier on in the name of the good, whatever punishments the demons deliver. This is moral heroism and deeply admirable as such. But it is also clear that the quasi-demonic scenario is morally repellent. It is one that a moral being, just because of what morality is, should hope never to inhabit. Now, I think that's an interesting claim, but I think it becomes much more compelling in a theistic context, or at the very least in a context in which what's presumed to be at the heart and foundation of reality is goodness, is a being like God who is good. Right? And then we can put the points which now has the existential resonance that we find in Kohelet, and it's sort of easy to raise, not difficult in the way that the problem that Segal might be talking about is difficult to raise. The problem would go as follows, I think. Right? Under the assumptions that God is wholly good, and so the one who clings to him, right, is clinging to what is wholly good. But tzaddik is one who clings to God. So anyone who clings to God is clinging to the good. And the assumption that God is the foundational and ultimate reality. Right? And so whatever is ultimately true is just what's true regarding God. But if you have those twin assumptions, which are, I think, assumptions at the heart of monotheism in general and Judaism in particular, then what we have is, the problem we have is the failure of the good to ultimately align with the good, and a failure of the bad to ultimately align with the bad. And that seems like a moral catastrophe. It's what's true ultimately, according to theism, since that's what's true regarding God, that is, like Johnston says, the kind of universe that we should hope never to inhabit, and we should be deeply troubled about inhabiting. And I think that's what can be seen as troubling Kohelet. That's what threatens the meaningfulness of it all. And despite the fact that God is taken to be good and fundamental and ultimate, the ultimate reality, yet the one who clings to him, the one who clings to that good and fundamental reality, doesn't thereby also bask in the rest of the goods. Right? There's just this mixture, something like disorder, chaos, and it's a moral chaos. It's not a physical chaos. It's a moral chaos that the good is not aligning with the good and the bad is not aligning with the bad. I think Heschel puts the point, maybe a related point, but I think one closely related. He puts it very nicely. He says, the dreadful confusion, the fact that there is nothing in this world that is not a mixture of good and evil, of holy and unholy, of silver and dross, is, according to Jewish mysticism, the central problem of history and the ultimate issue of redemption. The confusion goes back to the very process of creation. And he quotes a Zohar to that effect. In effect, what we have as the problem is that there's no separation, there's no neat separating of good and evil, that good attracts good and evil attracts evil. They're thoroughly mixed together in what seems to be a completely incomprehensible completely incomprehensible way, and in a way that threatens the very meaningfulness of our lives and of the universe. Okay, I think that's a way to put the third problem of evil, the one that emerges from looking at Kohelet and looking at Gemara. Okay, now this was by way of discussing what the problems are, and I'm aware of the fact that there are a number of questions. If everyone's okay with this, I'm going to try to finish what I had to say within the next 20 minutes, and then I'm happy to stick around and address some of these questions. Is that okay, Evie? Yes, okay.
Evie, yeah, that's completely fine.
Okay, so I think bearing this in mind is helpful in a lot of ways. It will be helpful in going forward in the other lectures. But I think it's also helpful already at this stage when we sort of lay out what are the presuppositions of the problem. What are we presupposing and going to continue to assume throughout, and not, you know, be willing to question? What are we not willing to give up? And there are two presuppositions I want to highlight now. There might be others, but two that are important. One is that there is evil. Right? That is, of course, a presupposition of the problem, as we've stated, or it's really an explicit assumption in standard formulations of the problem of evil. Okay, that there is evil, and it may seem so utterly obvious as to not even need stating, but I think first of all, it does need stating, and that's because there are really a number of ways you might deny that there is evil. Some of them wholly implausible, but some of them are a little less so. And some of them are implausible only because of the fact that there are these different questions, different problems out there. So how might you deny the claim that there is evil? I mean, it seems obscene, but at any rate absurd, whether it's obscene or not. It seems to be ridiculous to say that there is nothing bad that happens. And there really are a number of ways you might do that. You might suggest that there's no evil. One way would be to acknowledge the existence of the things that we ordinarily take to be evil. All of those events, experiences, and whatnot that we ordinarily classify as evil, and admit that they're fully existent, they're fully real. They're just as real as everything else that we take to have happened and to exist, but that they're not bad at all. There's just nothing bad about them. Now, this view really does seem to be, again, not only obscene, but also so implausible and ridiculous that it's not worth having to contend with it, or even mention it, really. I mention it only for completeness, and also because there's a version of that view, though, that we will come back to. The version that says that, yeah, those things exist and they are bad, but they're a lot less bad than we ordinarily take them to be. And that's something that we should take seriously. But set that aside for the moment. The other ways in which you might deny that there is evil is by denying the existence, or at least the full-blown, full-blooded existence of the things, those events and experiences that we ordinarily take to be evil. If those things never even happened, if those things aren't real, then we don't have to change our value judgments. We could say that even if those things were real, they would be horrific, they would be terrible, they would be evil, but they didn't happen, at least not really. Okay, now that might itself seem nuts, seem maybe even crazier than the first view. So how would you go about suggesting that? One version of that is something that you find in Hasidut. And it's something that there's an article by my friend and fellow philosopher Gabriel Citron, wrote a very interesting paper defending this as at least a possible theodicy. the idea that this world, this unredeemed world, is really just a dream, or maybe better, a nightmare. Right? And this isn't something without any traditional credentials. Like I said, in Chassidut, you do have hints of this, maybe even more than hints. So Moshe Chaim Ephraim, the Degel Machne Ephraim, on the pasuk that says that Vayikatz Yaakov Mishanato, that Yaakov awoke, the Vayomer Achein Yesh Adonai B'makom Hazeh V'anochi lo yadati Vayomar. Sorry, he says that the galut, the exile, right, is like a sleep. Okay, and the hester panim that we experience in those cases, in the galut, in the exile, is really just a very long slumber, during which we have a terrible collective, maybe cosmic nightmare. Right? And in him, it's not clear if it's meant literally or not, but in Rav Simcha Bunim, it does seem to be meant literally. Vayachalom, again on the same pasuk, al derech hamavor b'fchinat olam. This is the medieval work of Idaya Pnimi, olam hazeh hu hachalom. That literally, this world is just a dream, right? A nightmare. And of course, nightmares, well, they do involve some sort of experience, right? You experience things in nightmares, but there's some sense in which that which you are dreaming is only a dream, it's not real. Now, maybe you'll say this is scandalous. I don't know if that's really an argument of any sort, but I think that the real problem is that the experiences themselves are terrible enough, even if they are just nightmares. The experiences themselves are terrible enough to raise, seems to me, all of the problems of evil that we mentioned. So even if they're a lot less bad, again, like the suggestion we said we'll get back to, a lot less bad than we normally take them to be, because it's not real in some sense, but the suffering itself, the experience of the nightmare, well, that is still real. That can't be denied. Right? And as something that's undeniable, it creates the problem all by itself. But that's not really the predominant version, that's not the dominant version of this denial of evil view in the Jewish tradition. The dominant version comes in the medieval period, in the form of the theory, the Neoplatonic theory, that evil is a mere privation. Okay, and the Rambam, in his guide, in the Moreh Nevuchim, puts this forward, among other things that he says, and he says a variety of things about the problem of evil in a bunch of different places. But one of the things he puts forward in Chelek Gimel Perek Yud is this point. He says that evil itself is just like, in a way, a shadow. Right? It's parasitic upon the existence of the thing that's creating the shadow. But it's really, the shadow at the end of the day is just a lack. Right? It's the lack of light that's getting there. And he claims, he puts forward the view that all evil is like that. All evil, all suffering, all bad things, when you think through it, when you think about it deeply enough, you'll see that's really just a lack of something. And so he says that just as we wouldn't say that someone creates a shadow by placing something that interposes between a light source and the place where the shadow is, you don't create the shadow, because the shadow doesn't really exist. It's a byproduct of whatever it is that you created or did. So too, God didn't create evil. It was a necessary byproduct of creating a universe at all, or creating a universe in which there are material beings. Now, this has gotten a very bad rap, and maybe you yourselves are thinking, why are we wasting our time even mentioning this? So here are two thinkers who definitely did not think highly of this approach. Eliezer Berkovitz, in his book Faith After the Holocaust, says, it is needless to say that certainly after the Holocaust, such naive and well-meaning ideas have become more untenable than ever. The evil that created the ghettos and the death camps and ruled them with an iron fist was no mere absence of the good. It was real, potent, absolute. And Bertrand Russell, not himself a theist, but says the belief that as a matter of fact, nothing that exists is evil is one which no one would advocate except a metaphysician defending a theory. I'm a little offended by that because I'm a metaphysician and I defend theory, so I don't really see anything wrong with that. But at any rate, he says pain and hatred and envy and cruelty are surely things that exist and are not merely the absence of their opposites. But there really isn't anything here in either Berkowitz or Russell other than sort of digging in one's heels and denying what Maimonides is claiming, what the Neoplatonist view says. And it doesn't seem to me as wholly ridiculous as they make it out to be. If you start with what later philosophers called metaphysical evil, evil that's sort of just built into the universe as such, the primary case being the dissolution of things, disintegration of finite things, right, which in our case amounts to death. That is very plausibly construed as a lack, right? The non-existence of order, of maintaining the order that composite thing, that organism had until that point. And I think if you go on and think about, well, what really makes something bad, you think about loss. So death is bad maybe for the person who dies, but also for the person who loses them. Well, that also, of course, is in a sense a lack, separation, even if it doesn't involve loss, frustrated desires. These are all things that I don't think it's wholly implausible to say that they are lacks. Okay, they are non-beings, as you might put it. But what does that do for us? Let's grant the Rambam that that's true. It seems to me that it may go a long way toward addressing some of the traditional problems of evil. Right? So as addressing what's called the global problem of evil, not why is there this evil or that evil, but why is there evil at all? And more generally, or more specifically, sorry, why is there evil in this magnitude and with this distribution? The so-called global problem of evil in its classical philosophical guise, the one we saw from Hume and C.S. Lewis, I think it may have a lot to recommend it. Right? I mean, it's hard to see God as the author of evil if these things don't, strictly speaking, exist. Leibniz wasn't moved by this response, even though he was the one who thought, he did put forward the problem of the author of evil, and he didn't think that the privation response was adequate. But I think there's, in any case, what we've called attention to in Chazal and in Tanakh is enough to render the Rambam's solution sort of odious. It doesn't really do the work that we need it to do, because even if we grant that he's right, even if we take it more seriously than people are usually willing to take it, it doesn't at all address the failure of the good to align with the good and the bad with the bad, because it doesn't address the failure of being, of existence, of what's good, according to the Rambam, with clinging to God. That you still have the very same charge of tzaddik v'ralo, rasha v'tovlo, whether or not Ra is a lack, a non-being, or a being. It does nothing whatsoever, really, to address, I think, the standard rabbinic formulation of the problem of tzaddik v'ralo, rasha v'tovlo, which is why, if I'm not mistaken, nowhere does the Rambam bring up that formulation in that parak. Okay, when he cites the privation response, evil as privation, he doesn't bring the context, the standard rabbinic context of the Gemara and Brachot of tzaddik v'ralo, rasha v'tovlo. Perhaps because he saw that it wouldn't do much or anything to address the problem understood in that way. Okay, so that's where this is one example where it's very important and helpful to keep in mind the variety of problems, because we're going to see there might be a variety of solutions, okay, and or ways to address or answer any given question, and that's important. No one should think that any given answer has to carry the day or has to carry the sole burden of addressing the questions. But at the same time, we also have to remember the full burden of the questions. But it's not just one problem. It's not even just two problems. There are a number of very serious problems, intellectual and theoretical problems, that you have to contend with in trying to provide answers, and the answers really have to address all of them adequately. Okay, and I'll just conclude mentioning the second presupposition that we're going to hold fixed, which is that yes, evil exists, but evil is not fundamental. Evil is not at the heart of reality alongside God. Right? To think that it is, as far as I'm concerned, that's just a denial of monotheism. Right? And whatever we might say about certain biblical passages, maybe there are certain theological views, as John Levinson argues in his book Creation, the Persistence of Evil. He claims that there are some passages which we have preserved a theology which does see, it seems, a foundational role for some evil beings that God had to overcome from the very start. These are not God's playthings as we would have it in Barchi Nafshi from today's Mizmor Kuf Dalid, that Leviathan ze yatzarta lesachek bo. No, the Leviathan, Leviathan, according to this, is not something that God created, but was equally foundational with God. He points to Psalms 74, the verses I have here, verse 14, and is where he talks about the Leviathan. That may well be, and I'm not a biblical scholar, but at the very least, it doesn't. It's not the dominant view, and it's certainly not the view that became normative, and it's not the view that's philosophically of interest to me. Right? I mean, the view that I want to defend and grapple with and understand is the one according to which the only foundational reality, the only fundamental being, is God, and God is wholly good. So to try to answer the question, even if it would answer all three questions, and like we said earlier, it may not answer all three questions, even if it would answer all three questions, it would, as far as I'm concerned, be to give up the game. So that's what I had to say, and now I can look at all of these questions. I apologize that I didn't manage to sort of involve everyone while I was talking and address these. So I'm going to look at these, but people should also feel free to now raise questions. Just you can take off your microphone and ask. Okay, so in some cases it's hard for me to know which point these were addressing. I mean, I'm sure these are were on point, but it's not clear right now which points exactly were being addressed. So anyone should feel free to take the comment that they wrote there and just raise it now so that I understand what it's a question about, or raise another question, any question that you have, any thoughts that you have, figure out.
I could address mine if you can hear me.
Okay, yeah, please.
Sorry, I'm going to turn on my video. I was just reading that when Aaron's sons are incinerated because they offered the incense inappropriately, in the commentary in the Torah I was reading, it says that the righteous person is punished more severely than ordinary people. Mm-hmm. And wouldn't that be true for Moses as well? How he's not allowed to go into the Holy Land because, you know, he's held to a higher standard. So I was just talking about the idea of the righteous being suffering, that perhaps that's part of it as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. That is a view that's put forward already in the Gemara and in Midrashim, that the righteous are judged more harshly and are also maybe given opportunities to improve themselves morally through suffering that others are not given. And so there's sort of two ways of trying to explain why not only are the righteous suffering, but maybe the righteous suffer even more. right? And so that's sort of a further epicycle, right? That's an answer to the question of tzaddik viralo, that half of the question, why are the righteous suffering so much? You try to answer that either by saying, well, they're not so righteous, that's one answer, or by saying, as you are, maybe much more plausibly, that no, God actually has very good reasons to make the righteous suffer more. This is another case in which the second half of the formulation might present some difficulties. But how does that at all help us understand Rasha v'Tovlo? So you can continue the story, I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but you can continue this explanation and try to justify that as well and explain that. But we need to recognize that's a further burden to be discharged. You have to also explain now why the Rasha is Tovlo and maybe even more Tov than everyone else. But yeah, thank you. That's definitely, that's going to connect up with some of the stuff we're going to discuss next week when we discuss what I call theodicies of greatness. That is theodicies that capitalize on sort of the central role that humanity is supposed to play in the cosmos.
My question basically is, in the book of Job, God says, who are you to even question me? And I'd like to know what your answer to that is.
I don't have any answer to God. I wouldn't try to do that. But I do think that can be understood in a number of ways. And we'll highlight a number of those ways in the third and fourth lectures. So unfortunately, we won't get to this next week. But in the third lecture, when we talk about theodicies of smallness, that'll play a significant role. And the fourth lecture, and maybe this is how I think you're taking what God is saying, in the fourth lecture, we'll discuss approaches that basically just cut off the whole endeavor before it even starts and say, it's either unnecessary to try to come up with some such suggestion because God's ways are so much different and beyond our ways, or maybe even worse, it's sort of illegitimate for us to be sitting in this position and trying to come up with answers. And so that's exactly the quote unquote answer or approach that we're going to devote the final lecture to. Okay, so you got to stick around.
Thanks.
Till lecture 4 to get that, or I guess you could pop back in, but please do stick around because there will be a continuous narrative.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you. Looking forward to having you.
Okay, so go ahead.
If there's no other questions, can I ask a second one?
Yeah,
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay. So that notion of everyone's going to end up in heaven, or whatever the word would be in the Jewish faith. I was just noting that, like a bodhisattva in Buddhism, they don't go to nirvana till everybody goes. So there's this assumption that they're all going to make it. Is there something similar in terms of the Jewish notion of tikkun olam or the tzaddik's role, or is that just completely separate?
That's a fascinating question. I'm not aware of anything so stark as that would say that not only does everyone get there, but everyone, absolutely everyone, depends on everyone getting there for anyone to get there. So there wouldn't be any sort of, you might think, depending on what sort of heaven or afterlife or world to come, or I think exactly, you're thinking of, if the world to come that you're thinking of is something along the lines of Nachmanides and his disciples, which I think is well rooted in the rabbinic sources, that it's really a collective world to come. It's not like Maimonides and his disciples who thought that it's referring to some sort of individual disembodied afterlife. No, according to Nachmanides, we're talking about a post-resurrection embodied collective afterlife that would just go on eternally. Then I guess since it's collective, no one can attain it until everyone does, for sort of obvious tautological reasons. And if you would combine that, which Nachmanides himself doesn't, but if you would combine that with this view that I mentioned of Isaac Abohav, of 17th century Amsterdam, and others who follow him, that everyone will eventually, or will in fact merit the world to come, this resurrected collective afterlife, then yeah, I guess the two of those together would imply the view that you've stated. But I'm not aware of anyone who's sort of put the view out there in one package.
And I think Theo has a question as well. Theo, would you like to ask?
Certainly. Thank you so much. I have a question. It seems to me that in these sort of statements of the problem of evil that you gave, you left out some of the strongest statements of the problem. So I'm thinking of something like Thomas Aquinas, right? Where like it's sort of right, you know, God is infinite, and infinite cannot allow its opposite. So if God is good, it's not only that evil should not exist, it's that nothing should exist except for God, because nothing else is as good.
Yeah, okay, that is, I take it a specific instance of the first formulation, I think, where you sort of, you think that the very existence of anything on top of what's already perfectly good can only take away from the total good of the universe, and you point to that evil as an evil that God should not have allowed, even if it was necessary for creating something at all. You think, you argue, you claim that it's not something that he should have allowed. I mean, the reason I don't think it's necessarily the strongest version of that, or the best specific case, is because it's not really obvious that it's gratuitous evil, right? I mean, the question boils down to whether the great, or the good of having creatures, the good for creatures in their existing, is something that would justify, right, the evil of lowering the level of goodness of the universe as a whole. So, I mean, it's gratuitous only if it's not necessary for the attainment of some equally good state of affairs. If you think of goodness only as inhering in the universe as a whole, then maybe this is sort of an obvious verdict. But if you don't think that, and you think that you could evaluate this portion of the universe and say, well, it's good for him that he was created, it was good for us that we were created, then it's not obvious to me at all that this would be a gratuitous evil. It would be an evil, right? But it wouldn't obviously be a gratuitous one.
Doesn't that seem to admit that there are goods, like real independent goods, which cannot inhere in God's nature? Wouldn't that lead to a contradiction?
So explain to me what you mean. I mean, I do think there are goods.
So if they're real like objective goods, right? If you can say it's better like that creatures exist or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And they're goods that can only be achieved if free creatures exist, for instance, right? Then the question then becomes, I think, from my, like the question that I'm having trouble with is, if that's true, it seems to be the case that there are good things that do not inhere in the nature of God. So if God is a maximally great being, right, and therefore is maximally good, wouldn't all, the question is it a problem if there are goods that by their nature cannot inhere in God?
Right. So
like
I think that's exactly where I would get off the train. So I do think I would accept the classical theistic picture that God is perfectly good, and in fact, maximally good. But being maximally good does not mean and does not entail that God instantiates every possible good. There might be some possible goods that only a non-divine being could instantiate. I mean, there might be goods associated with being creaturely, with being needy in certain ways.
I like that. Thank you.
Does maximal goodness come to then? That's an excellent question. I mean, the same question arises regarding maximal power, and let's say just if maximal goodness, the goodness is construed not just morally, but to include all of what we consider to be good, like knowledge and power itself, then you have this standard problem, right? Of it could very well be that raising the magnitude of one of these will come at the expense of the other. There's no way to just make them all fully maximal. But yeah, I mean, it just in terms of the specific point you're making about, let's say, moral goodness, yeah, I do think that's true. I don't think there's anything problematic about that, there might be goods, possible goods, that God can't instantiate. Right?
Thank you.
Susan had another question.
Another question. I can't believe you made it through an hour's lecture without discussing free will. And
that's lecture number 2. So good. So now you're on the hook for 2, 3, and 4.
And isn't there a theology somewhere that God withdrew somewhat from to make space for humanity and for other things to exist, that God doesn't fill all the space completely? And as a consequence, we exist in that other space that God allowed to exist, and we have free will in that space.
Right. So yes, that's what we're going to get to next time. You sort of have to fill that out in order to explain how it's supposed to address the question. You have to make certain assumptions about freedom and its nature, and what God can allow without intervening, that maybe aren't obvious, these assumptions, once you start thinking about them. There is sort of a general line that you find in mystical sources that sounds a lot like what you were first suggesting, which doesn't really require a free will defense of any sort. It's sort of God contracting himself, this idea of tzimtzum, in order to allow there to be any creation at all, in order free or unfree, in order for there to be something else. But it's not obvious how that's a defense just yet, right? I mean, you still have to make certain claims about the value of that, and those might be controversial, like Theo. Am I pronouncing your name Theo correctly? Yeah. Right, like that may not solve the problem. It may just be part of the problem, right? Is how God could allow himself to do that. How could he contract himself to allow for things that are not only finite, but corrupt in certain ways. So but that is what we're going to talk about next time, right? I mean, that sort of move, that sort of answer, ones that rely on the great goods supposedly attendant upon the creation of things like human people. That's going to be the heart of next time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Segal, for this interesting first class and for taking some questions. And thank you to everyone who joined us today here on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook, if you were watching us there. We continue our spring program tomorrow at 8 p.m. with a class on death and the afterlife in the Rabbinic and Kabbalistic imagination with Dr. Nathaniel Berman and Rabbi David Silber. So I hope to see you there. In addition, we have many more classes happening right now and always. You can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes. Also, several of you asked me if it's possible to watch recordings of the sessions. The answer is yes. The sessions that are live are also recorded, so you can find recordings of the sessions on www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again for this opportunity to learn with you, Dr. Segal, and thanks again everyone who attended. And I hope to see you soon, either tomorrow evening or at another time in one of our classes here at Drisha. Thank you again, everyone.